back. So the fraud and money laundering Nulane Investments trial is underway in the Free State High Court. You will have seen our rolling coverage with Aaron Bates, who's closely tracking that case. The state has used the case to secure Interpol red notices and the arrest in Dubai of two Gupta brothers. Details of business between companies linked to the family, politicians and government departments have been emerging in the case. But let's unpack this morning whether there is some risk to the success of this case. Michael Marchant is the head of investigations at Open Secrets, and he joins us via our video link this morning. Michael, thanks very much for coming on. Great to see you. That really is the question. Given the kind of testimony we've heard over the past week, especially the conduct of the Hawks investigator, the Hawks lead investigator, Colonel Mandla Mtolo, some rudimental aspects of the case apparently being overlooked by him. Given how important this case potentially is insofar as state capture cases is concerned, is it at risk?
Morning, Michelle, and thank you very much for having me. I think what we've seen over the last week shows that it is fundamentally at risk. And actually what we saw in the last 2 days seems to suggest that it is very likely that the case is over, that every single accused bar one will be asking for a Section 174 discharge, which essentially means they're going to tell the court that they don't even need to respond to the case put forward by the state because it doesn't actually present them anything to respond to. And as you say, this is really based around two fundamental issues. The one is the actual conduct of the investigators at the Hawks and elsewhere in terms of managing the evidence and establishing its authenticity and how far they've gone to try and establish and find primary documents. And if they can't find them, to persuade the court why they can't find them and that they should be able to use the documents that they have available to them. And then the second aspect here, which is deeply troubling in addition to that, is that the MPA, despite indicating that they would do so, have seemingly abandoned the attempt to enter the Gupta leaks, the trove of millions of banking records and emails and other fundamental evidence to all state capture cases. They are not arguing for its admissibility in this case. And I think that beyond the Nulane matter, as you've suggested, it's so disturbing because in the last week, all appearances are that the state just wasn't ready to do this, and yet that they've been telling the public that this was an easily winnable case and that they were ready to proceed. So for it to have fallen apart so dramatically over the last week really raises, I think, very fundamental questions about the MPA's preparedness for not only this case, but for taking forward a range of often more complex state capture matters, which they have assured us will be proceeding over the next year or so.
I mean, that's devastating, isn't it, Michael, for exactly the reasons that you've just outlined, because the ID from the onset said that this case, even though the amounts involved are relatively small compared to other state capture allegations, that it is a winnable case and that it sets the tone for other state capture matters to make it to the trial stage. So what does this mean then, Michael, for exactly that going forward and our ability to successfully prosecute financial crimes?
Well, it raises very serious doubts, but I think that we should remember one thing. So on the one hand, it's deeply concerning because, as we've said, the MPA appears not to have been prepared for this. And I would also want to stress, particularly in this instance, as you've kind of mentioned, Michelle, this is not a particularly complicated case. One of the reasons we at Open Secrets and others in civil society, I think, were so happy to see this case proceed is that many of the charges are very straightforward. There are allegations that people in the Free State Department of Agriculture, for example, violated procurement law. This is a very straightforward charge, and it's also one that arguably you could bring against hundreds of officials over the next years with regard to state capture. And so I think if the NPA is unable to bring this kind of charge successfully, it raises serious doubts, as you say, about their ability to prosecute the more complex financial crimes. There was a money laundering aspect to this trial which the MPA has done very little to do in this trial, and that takes us back to the issues of the Gupta leaks. And then maybe just to focus on why that is so concerning, this is also the case that the MPA has almost hinged the extradition of the two Gupta brothers from the UAE on, that they were considering adding other charges, but this is where they felt they were going to be able to do that. And so the most immediate consequence, it would appear, is that extradition is put at massive risk, and we don't know what's going to happen with that. And then the other question really is that the MPA keeps telling the public, and they've gone to Parliament several times, to talk about the 9 seminal state capture cases and that they are very nearly ready to go. But really then this raises a huge number of doubts as to whether that is the case and whether they really are ready to proceed. Yeah.
Just as part of sort of our unpacking and us trying to understand where things went wrong with this Nulane case, Michael, the ID's own financial investigator, Ntokozo Zama, who was previously with the State Capture Inquiry, he was also grilled over his financial analysis of certain transactions, right?
Yes, and I think that to try and pinpoint exactly what's gone wrong here, and I think that this is quite an important point for us also as a public to really grapple with, is that this is not a problem of the court kind of throwing out the evidence in the case and saying there is no evidence of the crimes that are being alleged here. It's a much more practical and procedural point, and the point that they're making is that the state, whether it be the MPA investigators or the Hawks, simply haven't made any effort to tell the court, which is required in a criminal trial from a more technical legal aspect, why the evidence is admissible. And it's the very fundamentals of a criminal trial is that you would want both the investigators and the ID. One of the first things they would need to do is work out what evidence is admissible and how they're going to legally argue for that admissibility. And so the fact that the case is falling down around those issues of preparedness, issues of an absence of legal arguments as to admissibility,
the basics,
and not falling down on facts is the most troubling aspect, I think, of what's happened here.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course it comes in the context of what the finance minister had to say earlier this week, right? That South Africa needs to prepare for grey listing. And part of that, part of what Gorongwana had to say in the budget was that what we need is more prosecutions of exactly these kinds of crimes.
Completely. And it takes us back to those questions of the more complex crimes. It also takes us fundamentally to the question of the state's ability to prosecute more complex cases related to the private sector, not just related to state capture, but systemic fraud. We've spoken, for example, often about how the failure to move on cases related to Steinhoff or Tongaat Hulett. And it really demands the question about whether the state is ready to proceed on complex fraud cases in the private sector and to prosecute without fear or favor. Michelle, the last thing I would just put in on that point, which I think is quite important to note, is that it also raises the question of how honest the MPA leadership has been with the public about the status of the skills and the capacity within the MPA, and their apparent strange reluctance to engage in the expertise of outside counsel where it may be helpful. And so one of the things that is fairly disturbing to see at the moment is that we don't see many of the independent counsel that the MPA has spoken about assisting on state capture cases. We increasingly don't see them in these kinds of matters. And I can't answer to you why that's the case, but if it is this strange issue of some kind of pride that we can do this internally alone and we will begin to cut out those people independent who may be able to assist, if that's happening and this is the kind of consequence, then Parliament urgently needs to call the MPA leadership to grill them and ask them how they're making those kinds of decisions, if this is the outcome and the consequence for the public and for accountability more broadly.
Yeah. And the fact of it is, Michael, that's exactly what we've been told. We have been told that we do have the expertise. There is great faith in the investigating directorate and the work that it's able to do, that we're getting state capture cases to the trial stage and that this is just the beginning of much, much more to come. There's just no overstating this. This will be devastating if this case indeed does fall apart, and by all accounts, it looks like it's heading that way.
It does have the potential to be devastating. And I think, as we've said, this case in particular does look like it's fallen apart. The one silver lining that I would want to add, and this is maybe an important point for us all to remember, is that the argument, for example, around the admissibility of the Gupta leaks has not been made, and therefore it hasn't been lost in this trial. And so it is possible at the next state capture trial that proceeds, whether that is the big Transnet matter, for example, or any other one, it is possible, of course, for the state, and they will surely have to do it, to then have that trial within the trial there and to make those arguments for admissibility. But then in that case, this Nulane matter stands as an absolutely stark warning for the MK's need to prepare urgently for those arguments and not to leave it for the last minute and seemingly to be caught on the hop on these kinds of questions. They are the fundamentals to a criminal case which should be prepared well in advance.
Yeah, I thought that went without saying. But all right then, Michael Marchant, let me thank you for your time this morning. He's the head of investigations at Open Secrets as we continue to unpack and follow that Nulane case that's been unfolding at the High Court in the Free State. It's just